Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Isabella Nicosia with ISO Stakeholder Affairs, and I'd like to welcome you to today's Executive Appeals Committee hearing. I'm also joined on the line by the three committee members, Elliot Mainzer, President and CEO, Roger Collington, Vice President, General Counsel, and Chief Compliance Officer, and Stacey Crowley, Vice President, External and Customer Affairs. I'm also joined on the line by a few other ISO staff members, including John Gooden, Senior Manager, Infrastructure and Regulatory Policy, Anthony Ivankovich, Deputy General Counsel, David Zlotlow, Senior Counsel, Greg Cook, Executive Director, Market and Infrastructure Policy, Abdul Muhammad Ali, Resource Management Specialist Lead from our Operations Engineering Services team, and Joanne Serena, Executive Director, Customer Service and Stakeholder Affairs. Today's hearing is being recorded. The recording is for informational and convenience purposes only, and any related transcription should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. With that, I'll hand it over to Stacey Crowley for some opening remarks.
Thank you, Isabella. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Executive Appeals Committee hearing. As Isabella said, my name is Stacey Crowley, and I am joined today by my fellow committee members, Elliot Mainzer and Roger Collington. The ISO Business Practice Manual Change Management Process enables the ISO and affected parties to propose and track all requested changes to ISO Business Practice Manuals called Proposed Revision Requests, or PRRs. The process also includes the right to appeal a final decision for reconsideration on a PRR to an appeals committee consisting of ISO executives, which is the three of us. During today's meeting, the committee will hear from 6 appellants, CEDMC, CLICA, CPUC, MWD, PG&E, and SCE. We will also hear from ISO staff and other interested stakeholders on PRR 1280, Local Regulatory Authority Resource Adequacy Adjustment, which affects the BPM for reliability requirements. So we will explain all of those acronyms later. If you could switch to slide 2. Okay. First, the ISO will present an overview of the BPM change management process and discuss the process timeline for PRR 1280. We'll then hear from the 6 appellants. Each appellant will have 10 minutes to present their positions. Following the appellant remarks, the ISO will share its perspective. And after hearing from the appellants and the ISO, stakeholders will have the opportunity to make comments or ask questions. Those who submitted written comments will be heard first. In this case, we have WAPA joining us. Parties may not raise PRR issues outside of the scope of this appeal, and the committee will have its discretion to manage the meeting and examine the appellant. So I'm going to turn it over to Isabella, Stakeholder Engagement and Policy Specialist. She will provide an overview of the BPM change management process and discuss PRR 1280 and its process timeline. I'll turn it over to you, Isabella.
Thanks, Stacey. Yeah, so as Stacey mentioned, I will be providing an overview of the BPM change management process and then a specific process timeline for PRR 1280. So in accordance to our tariff and BPM change management process, any changes to the California ISO BPMs must be initiated by submittal of a proposed revision request, otherwise referred to as a PRR. And each PRR goes through a 2-month stakeholder process, beginning with the submittal of the PRR. And this process allows participants to submit comments after initial submission, posting of the recommendation, and then again after the posting of the final decision. This process also allows the ISO to post responses to comments, address questions, and provide clarification, and then post recommendations in a final decision. BPM change management meetings take place every month to discuss the PRRs that are either in the initial or recommendation stage of the process. And then following the issuance of a final decision, the submitter or any affected market participant can submit an appeal to the ISO for reconsideration of the final decision. So specific to the PRR 1280 process timeline, there are a few key dates I'd like to highlight. The ISO submitted PRR 1280 on August 27th, 2020, And then initial comments were received from CPUC on September 15th, and then from SCE, PG&E, and SDG&E on September 16th. These comments were discussed during the stakeholder call on September 29th. In October, the ISO posted the recommendation, and the recommendation comments were received from stakeholders, and then the ISO posted responses to comments, which were discussed during the October 27th monthly meeting. CEDMC, CLECA, CPUC, MWD, PG&E, and SCE filed appeals on November 13th, and then the ISO posted its answering brief leading us to today's Executive Appeals Committee hearing. The remaining dates will be discussed at the end of today's meeting. So with that, I will hand it back to Stacy, and we can get started with our appellate remarks.
Thank you, Isabella. So we have the following speakers in the order that I named them, providing remarks. The first is Greg Wilker. I'm just going to read through them here, and then I'll let you all go in that order. Nora Sheriff, we'll have Simon Baker, and Sean Bailey, Scott Ronzell, and Jeff Nelson. So I will now turn it over to Greg.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Good afternoon. My name is Greg Wickler, and I am the Executive Director of the California Efficiency and Demand Management Council. The Council, established in 2009, is a statewide trade association of non-utility companies that provide energy efficiency, demand response, and data analytics products and services throughout California. Our members include implementation and evaluation firms, engineering and architectural firms, data analytics firms, contractors, financing experts, energy service companies, and product manufacturers and distributors. Our members include over 65 companies and organizations who employ a large portion of California's 300,000 plus efficiency and demand management workforce. I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to address the Executive Appeals Committee today on CAISO's proposed revisions to the Reliability Requirement Business Practice Manual through PRR 1280. I won't reiterate the Council's entire appeal, but I would like to highlight a concern that is of particular importance that has not been addressed by the other appellants. Specifically, I'd like to address an overlooked aspect of PRR 1280 that directly impacts DR resources that are included in the supply plans. Hereafter, I'll refer to this as Supply Plan DR. In its brief, the CAISO incorrectly claims that PRR 1280 does not infringe on the CPUC's authority to establish qualifying capacity values for resources seeking to provide system RA capacity. However, the qualifying capacity value of the supply plan would, in fact, be affected by PR 1280. Just for background, the resource adequacy value of the IOU's DR programs is determined by the CPUC's Energy Division based on forecasted load impacts using the demand response load impact protocols. These RA values are then trued up to account for avoided T&D losses and planning reserve margins, and then credited against LSE's RA requirements based on their load ratio share. Under PRR 1280, the entire RA value of these programs would not be recognized because these DR programs are not included in the LSE's supply plans. Similar to the IOU DR programs, Supply Plan DR also benefits from the avoided T&D losses and planning reserve margin adders. It's the Council's understanding that once this capacity is procured by an LSE and included in its supply plan, the CPUC Energy Division will then reduce the contracting LSE's RA requirement by an amount that's equal to the avoided T&D losses and planning reserve margin adders associated with that supply plan, DR. PRR 1280 will eliminate any non-net zero crediting of LSE supply plans, so it will diminish the system RA value of supply plan DR resources because the CAISO would no longer recognize its full RA value. This will in turn reduce the amount of RA capacity that DRPs can sell to the load-serving entities. Such an outcome is completely counter to the recommendations made in the recently finalized preliminary root cause analysis report that new resources, in particular demand response, need to be brought online by summer of 2021. And it's really difficult to understand how PRR 1280 is consistent with this recommendation and how reducing the amount of RA capacity provided by DR will address potential capacity shortfalls in 2021 and beyond. I'd like to conclude by respectfully cautioning the CAISO that its actions threaten to undermine the DR bifurcation policy that it fought for so strongly just a few years ago. Should the CAISO press forward and adopt PRR 1280 pursuant to Public Utilities Code Section 380, the CPUC would be well within its rights to roll back bifurcation and reflect the RA value of IOU DR programs and third-party DR resources in the California Energy Commission's peak demand forecast, as is currently done today with the IOU's critical peak pricing programs. The system RA value of DR programs and resources could then be reflected in a reduced peak load forecast, which would in turn reduce LSC RA requirements. And as a closing comment, the Council is very much open to a negotiated outcome that preserves the RA value of IOU DR programs and third-party DR resources by either reducing or meeting an LSC's RA requirement. However, in order for this to occur, the CAISO should withdraw PRR 1280 until a solution can be developed in the context of the CPUC's resource adequacy proceeding. Thank you once again for the opportunity to speak today.
Thank you very much, Greg. Nora Sheriff?
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Good afternoon, and thank you for your attention today. My name is Nora Sheriff, and I represent the California Large Energy Consumers Association of CLECA. I plan to use my time to first describe CLECA, then discuss a key point that I believe should guide your decision here, and finally, I will respond to several specific statements in the CAISO staff appeals brief. So CLECA is an energy advocacy organization comprised of large high load factor and high voltage industrial customers with facilities located throughout the state of California, but primarily in the service territories of Southern California Edison Company and Pacific Gas and Electric Company. The aggregate annual electric demand averages about 500 megawatts, and the aggregate annual consumption averages about 3,000 gigawatt hours, which equates to the annual electricity consumption of about 470,000 average California households. For the CLECA members, their individual facilities' annual demand ranges from about 1 megawatt to close to 70 megawatts. So these are very large industrial facilities. They usually operate 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and their demand is not weather sensitive. Rather, it's driven by continuous industrial manufacturing processes. The CLECA member companies are in the steel, cement, industrial gases, beverage, pipeline transportation, cold storage, and mining industries, and these are industries that compete internationally. For CLECA members, the cost of electricity is a significant factor in the cost of producing their product or service here in California, and this impacts their global competitiveness. The cost of electricity can range from 40% of the cost of production to over 80% of the cost of production for the CLECA members. All CLECA members accordingly participate in the Investor-Owned Utility Demand Response Program, known as the Base Interruptible Program, or BIP, with most having participated in BIP and its predecessor interruptible tariff since the early 1980s. BIP helps them offset the high cost of California electricity and maintain their industrial operations in the state. BIP is highly reliable with a long, strong history of proven performance, and it has been integrated into the CAISO market as Reliability Demand Response Resources, or RDRR. Almost all CLECA members are emissions-intensive trade-exposed entities, or EITE entities. This specific designation means that California actively seeks to keep these EIT entities in the state to avoid emissions leakage. Emissions leakage would harm the state's goal to reduce carbon emissions. As the California Air Resources Board explains, quote, Emissions leakage can occur when production moves out of state, so there appears to be a reduction in California's greenhouse gas emissions, but the production and emissions have simply been relocated, end quote. So California needs the EIT entities to stay in California, and for the CLECA members that are EITE, they need the BIP to do so. Turning to the key point that I believe should guide your decision here, it's a simple one. We're all in this together, and we should act accordingly. The challenges facing our state from climate change are significant and include catastrophic wildfires and extreme weather events. And this past summer, they included rolling blackouts during an extended heat storm in August and the risk of rolling blackouts in a second extended heat storm in September. We should all agree that we should work together to avoid Californians being subject to rolling blackouts again. The CPUC has calculated that about 1,500 megawatts of system resource adequacy provided by demand response resources, including BIP, are placed at risk by this PRR. Yet BIP resources dependably help reduce rolling blackouts in the energy crisis, were used by CAISO to resolve grid emergencies in 2014 and 2017, were used by PG&E for local transmission emergencies in 2017, 2018, and 2019. BIP also responded successfully to CAISO calls in Edison's local capacity areas in 2019 and 2020, and also performed admirably during the August and September heat storms. It's a carbon-free resource. It has the additional benefit of keeping EIT entities in the state and avoiding leakage, a policy goal that neither this committee nor the Board of Governors nor CAISO staff should ignore. If these carbon-free resources were not counted, despite the LRA's decision to credit them, that would send a chilling signal to BIP participants regarding the viability of this proven cost-effective program. Moreover, it is most likely that any CAISO backstop procurement undertaken to take the place of the discredited DR resources would be for fossil fueled resources. I know of no backstop procurement by the CAISO for preferred carbon-free resources. To the best of my knowledge, when the CAISO backstops, it procures gas-fired generation. Thus, any CAISO backstop procurement would regrettably and needlessly actually increase carbon emissions in addition to harming state policy goals to avoid emissions leakage and reduce emissions. I note that state law compels the CAISO to, quote, conduct its operations consistent with the applicable state and federal laws and consistent with the interests of the people of the state, end quote. Again, we're all in this together, and we should act accordingly. We shouldn't needlessly risk reliability and negative impacts to California's climate goals. As explicitly acknowledged by CAISO staff, the CAISO board in July, this crediting issue is to be addressed in the CPUC's RA proceeding. The issue is squarely before the CPUC. It should not be prejudged here. An expedited BPM change that results in a significant impact is not transparent, open decision-making, and the abbreviated process here with shortened deadlines and no reply brief precludes a collaborative approach to determine the merits of various proposals. Now, turning to responses to statements in the CAISO staff appeals brief. At page 24, the staff brief discusses the fact that resources may provide benefits or may have performed well during a stressed grid condition does not transform them into RA capacity or mean they are capable of regularly performing up to RA standards, and the staff brief also discusses the need to apply RAIN to credited DR resources. I've already discussed BIP's proven performance, but regarding the incentives and obligations of RA capacity, I note that wind and solar resources are not subject to RAIN, nor are demand response auction mechanism resources sized under 1 megawatt. Yet this PRR would seek application of RAIN to the DR resources in question, which I believe would be unduly discriminatory, and that would be an issue litigated before FERC. Equally importantly, however, the BIP retail tariff includes very steep penalties for non-performance. Excess energy charges are paid on every kilowatt hour above the firm service level, and non-performance could lead to removal from the base interruptible program. Those excess energy charges for Southern California Edison range from $10.60 a kilowatt hour to $12.49 a kilowatt hour. For PG&E, they're $6 a kilowatt hour. Those are steep. The CAISO brief also says on page 14 that under the tariff, the LRA's authority to establish qualifying capacity values for resource adequacy resources does not extend to granting RA credits for resources not shown on RA plans and supply plans. You must recognize that the CAISO tariff does not set the boundary for the LRA's authority. The LRA authority is established by California statute, and the California statute allows the LRAs to credit resource adequacy. There is a hierarchy of legal authority. At the top, we have the constitutions, first the United States Constitution, then state constitutions, then foreign constitutions. Then we have statutes, first federal statutes, then state statutes, then foreign statutes. This is where the California Public Utilities Code statute sits. Then you have treaties and international agreements, followed by case law, with federal case law at the top being the U.S. Supreme Court, then the Courts of Appeal, district courts, bankruptcy courts, down to state courts. After that come administrative regulations, which is where the FERC-approved tariff sits. The CAISO's brief claim that it cannot continue a practice that is inconsistent with the tariff fails to recognize that CAISO actions must comply with governing statutes, including state statutes, and the CAISO tariff and the BPM cannot be read to undermine the express language in the statute. Finally, at page 19, the staff brief says, quoting isolated passages from board materials on slow DR initiative does not render PRR 1280 an illegitimate or unauthorized business practice change. Again, I remind you what Mr. Rothleader and Mr. Cook told the Board of Governors on July 22nd, that the CPUC deferred the ultimate decision whether the resources need to be shown to be counted or whether they could be credited. We weighed in on that. It will be addressed later this year or early next year. The crediting issue is teed up at the CPUC. The staff told the board in July that this was a live issue there and that it would be decided there. A month later, however, with this PRR, that all changed. This unfortunate approach is not conducive to a trusting and cooperative relationship, and unilateral action with an outcome presented as a fait accompli in a short-change procedural process chills debate and hinders collaboration. In closing, I respectfully request that you grant this appeal, direct the CAISO staff to work with the CPUC and stakeholders in the CPUC RA proceeding, which is, again, exactly where your staff told your board in July that this specific crediting issue would be addressed. And don't act unilaterally with this problematic BPM change. Once addressed in the CPUC's RA proceeding, the CAISO should, per state law, use the LRA's criteria for crediting and accounting. And again, I thank you for your time to speak today. I thank you for your attention. I'll look forward to answering any questions you have.
Thank you very much, Nora. We'll turn it to Simon Baker. Sorry, Simon. Simon, do you want to go ahead?
Okay. Sound check. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, good. Well, I wish we had video interface here so that I could see some of the faces that I'm speaking to, but I'll do my best here to speak to you blindly. Good afternoon, CAISO executives, management, and staff. Thank you for this opportunity to discuss the PUC staff's appeal of PRR 1280. My name is Simon Baker. I'm the Director of Cost, Rates, and Planning within the Energy Division at the PUC. And I'll be discussing our appeal and our request here today. First, let me acknowledge the difficult position I understand CAISO to be in with regard to the issues we're discussing here. As we stated in our brief, PUC staff understands and appreciates CAISO's concern about the reliability of the grid, which we share, especially in light of the August 2020 heat storm. However, we believe that the IOU DR programs that the PUC allocates through credits to all PUC jurisdictional entities materially helped to address the reliability issues experienced during the August heat storm. Accordingly, we do not believe that it would be appropriate at this time for CAISO to reject the PUC's decades-long practice of using DR credits and to determine unilaterally that DR resources neither reduce nor meet RA requirements unless they comport with CAISO's proposals, such as those that are pending in the PUC's RA proceeding. Not only would this be an expensive proposition for ratepayers, it does not comport with state law, the Energy Action Plan loading order, or state policy preferences, as I'll discuss later. We understand that in light of the August heat storm and how individual resource types performed, the CAISO has valid reasons to review its crediting policy. However, the approach taken in this BPM change is overbroad, and while it addresses one factor that led to shortages, it also targets resources that help meet demand on these peak days. Should CAISO be concerned about the quality of the credits for other types of resources, CAISO could narrowly tailor its requirements to those resources. If the CAISO has concerns regarding over-reliance on DR, CAISO could post additional information on the use of DR by local regulatory authorities to provide further transparency regarding the scope of the issue so that stakeholders can engage in a more informed discussion about the problem and possible solutions. In other words, we agree that there are real issues that need to be addressed, but we believe that this proposal, introduced very late in the procurement cycle for PUC jurisdictional LSEs, is too blunt of a tool to address the issues before us. We believe there's a path forward to resolve CAISO's issues with crediting of PUC jurisdictional DR programs, but all parties will need to be willing to compromise. Many of these issues, such as whether to require IOU-DR programs to go onto CAISO supply plans and how to address DR seasonality, are pending in Phase 4 of the PUC's RA proceeding, as mentioned by previous speakers. And it's there that we believe that those issues can and should be addressed and considered in a timely fashion. Prior to CAISO initiating this BPM change, I personally had several conversations with CAISO staff, which gave me the sense that we could find a way to resolve CAISO's concerns in a manner in which the PUC could agree. These issues are included in the next set of policy questions we plan to tackle in the RA proceeding. Our request is for CAISO to defer further consideration of this BPM until that process runs its course, and we believe that substantial progress can be made in time for the 2022 RA cycle. Our appeal rests on 5 main points, and I'll discuss each in turn. First, in our appeal, we noted that CAISO provided no tariff language or citations to support this BPM change. In its response to the appeals, CAISO staff now cites certain tariff provisions, including 40.3 and 40.7, to justify its position. PUC staff disagree that these provisions require the PUC to require LSEs to place all RA resources onto supply plans. That's a determination for the PUC to make under its SB 380 authority, and we have not yet made that determination. However, even if this were the case, CAISO still does not fully explain its abrupt reversal from accepting DR credits from the PUC since the beginning of the RA program, and why, if it contravened its tariff, it was acceptable over the last decades, but not now. Second, we believe the proposed BPM change intrudes on PUC jurisdiction. PU Code 380 states that the PUC, in consultation with the CAISO, shall establish RA requirements for all LSEs. Further, it states the PUC shall establish new or maintain existing DR products and tariffs that facilitate use of DR that can either meet or reduce an IOU's RA requirements as determined by the PUC. In accordance with state law, the PUC has determined that DR resources do reduce RA requirements, and the CAISO, through the CPM change, is effectively rejecting this determination. As previously mentioned, the PUC is open to revisiting this determination, such as by requiring IOU-DR programs to be shown on supply plans, but that decision must be made in the RA proceeding. Third, PUC staff believes that this is not a ministerial issue, and thus it is inappropriate to make this change to the BPM process. The FERC conditioned approval of CAISO's BPM process on the finding that it will not have a material impact on rates, terms, or conditions. The proposed change amounts to a de facto new requirement imposed on DR resources to qualify as system capacity. Therefore, CAISO's action will likely lead to either LSEs procuring additional capacity or the CAISO procuring excess capacity through the CPM, because CAISO identified a shortfall that the PUC did not. This can and will have a material impact on rates. Fourth, CAISO's proposal has not been approved by the CAISO board and lacks adequate stakeholder process. In documents prepared for CAISO's July board meeting, CAISO staff explained its efforts to integrate Slow DR as a local capacity resource, as a remedy to the CAISO 2016 BPM Appeals Committee decision, in which the CAISO committed to initiate a stakeholder process to develop a way to operationalize Slow DR resources. The board presentations make no reference to System RA, our main issue of concern. The PUC was aware that CAISO might take this position and has put forward in this BPM for local RA. but we were wholly surprised to see this expanded to System RA. In addition, we note that on the stakeholder call to discuss the proposed DPM change, CAISO staff left limited time to discuss this item, which was the most contentious of all items on the agenda. And CAISO staff did not allow for comments from an unknown number of callers, cutting off the call during Q&A. CAISO staff were not responsive to comments and said they needed to carry on as reflected in the PRR. To give a sense of how disruptive this is to our procurement process, after decades of accepting PUC credits, in August of this year, after the PUC released its yearly RA decision, issued initial RA requirements, developed its templates and guides, and was mere weeks from issuing its final requirements, the CAISO quite unexpectedly reversed course and upended the carefully balanced choreography that leads up to the year-ahead RA showings, with no advanced stakeholder input or consultation. Fifth, and finally, CAISO's proposal is inconsistent with state law and state policy regarding the loading order. PU Code 380 empowers the PUC to establish RA requirements in consultation with the CAISO, and in so doing must advance, to the extent possible, the state goals for clean energy. Further, the RA program shall maintain existing products and tariffs that facilitate use of DR to meet or reduce an LSE's RA requirements. As previously noted, aspects of the CAISO's proposal are pending in a PUC proceeding, but they have yet to be decided. We are committed to addressing the issues in collaboration with CAISO, but we object to CAISO taking this action unilaterally. In effect, CAISO's proposed DPM change would circumvent California's loading order policy, which is codified in part under PU Code 454, and essentially says that in meeting its energy needs, California will first invest in energy efficiency and demand-side resources such as DR before other resources. Finally, PU Code 345.5 requires the CAISO to conduct its operations consistent with applicable state laws and consistent with the interests of the people of the state. The same statute requires CAISO to consult and coordinate with state agencies to ensure that it operates in furtherance with state law regarding consumer and environmental protection. We view this unilateral action to disallow crediting of DR resources, while related issues are active and pending a PUC decision, as inconsistent with PU Code 380 and insufficiently consultative. For all these reasons, PUC staff respectfully appeals CAISO's determination regarding PRR 1280 and requests that CAISO either withdraw it or hold it in abeyance until the PUC has considered CAISO's proposal to eliminate DR credits for system resources. We stand ready to engage with CAISO and stakeholders to find a workable solution to these issues in the RA proceeding. Thank you for your consideration of our appeal, and we look forward to further dialogue with CAISO management and staff on these issues.
Thank you very much, Simon. Next, we'll go to Sean Bailey.
Yes, thank you for the opportunity to address the committee on PRR 1280. PRR 1280 does not work for Metropolitan Water District of Southern California. MWD is committed to providing sufficient capacity to meet its resource adequacy obligation in the ISO system, and MWD's ability to interrupt its load almost instantaneously has been and continues to be a valuable source of dependable capacity for the region. But it must be administered according to our operating agreement with the ISO and not treated as a supply resource. This is a case where one size does not fit all. I'd like to start by providing a little background on MWD's system, since it provides some useful context for my remarks today. The Colorado River Aqueduct extends 242 miles from the Colorado River to the Los Angeles Basin, and is a critical source of water for the Southern California region. The Colorado River Aqueduct system includes 5 pumping stations and almost 300 megawatts of load, and all 8 pumps at each station are operating. The system operates by gravity feed from one pumping station to the next, and it takes 24 hours to execute a pump change from the time the change is initiated at the intake pumping station on the Colorado River to the time the change finally takes effect at the last pumping station at Julian Hines north of Palm Springs. What this means is MWD's load is consistent and predictable, and the MWD board, as our local regulatory authority, has considered this in establishing our resource adequacy program. The MWD Board of Directors, as the local regulatory authority, has authorized the use of an interruptible program at MWD's intake and Gene pumping stations in order to meet MWD's resource adequacy capacity obligations in the ISO. but the MWD board has also prohibited MWD from bidding the interruptible load at intake and gene into the ISO markets. Given the critical role of the CRA system in meeting regional water needs, the interruption of the pumps at intake and gene must be considered in such a way as to maintain water system reliability. Reservoirs at the intake and gene pumping plants can be used to maintain CRA operation for short periods based on reservoir levels and pumping rate, and the reservoirs must be replenished to make additional load reductions available. MWD's interruptible load is unique in this respect, and the ISO's objectives of having MWD's interruptible load program operate as a supply resource to be dispatched solely based on price and power system needs does not fit the situation. The primary consideration in interrupting the gene and intake pumps must be to maintain Colorado River Aqueduct operation and the water supply to Southern California. The interruption of these pumps requires coordination between the ISO and MWD as prescribed in MWD's operating agreement with the ISO. The timing and duration of the interruption must be established in discussion with the ISO based on current system needs and reservoir levels. But once the decision has been made, the pumps at intake and gene can be shut down with the push of a button. There's no uncertainty about how much demand reduction will occur. However, it should also be noted that the Colorado River Aqueduct system is almost 90 years old, and it operates with much of its original equipment. Frequent starts and stops of the pumps could impact water system reliability, and we need to work together to balance water system reliability and power system reliability. In joining the ISO in 2017, MWD worked closely with the ISO to establish an operating agreement that addresses the ISO's use of the MWD interruptible load. Since that time, MWD has shown its interruptible load as a peak load reduction in its resource adequacy showings as approved by the ISO. This approach is reasonable for MWD, as it is uniquely situated with complete control over its pumping load. As I noted earlier, MWD's load is stable and predictable and does not give rise to the issues associated with balancing intermittent generation that the ISO is attempting to address. It would be a significant financial impact if MWD could not use its interruptible load to meet its capacity obligations, and would result in a loss of up to roughly 100 megawatts of capacity for the region. The current process by which the ISO utilizes MWD's interruptible load for RA purposes is beneficial to the ISO maintaining grid reliability. Leading into the August heat wave, the week of August 10th, MWD power operations considered the potential for the ISO to call on MWD for pump interruption. And after the first stage 3 emergency occurred in the evening of August 14th, MWD took the proactive step of reducing Colorado River Aqueduct operation from 7 pumps at each station to 3 pumps, or an almost 150 megawatt reduction as conditions on MWD's system at the time allowed. MWD also reconfigured its distribution system in order to provide additional generation from DWR's Devil Canyon power plant and MWD's hydro generation in the LA Basin, both providing critical sources of local area capacity. I'd like to address the process that the ISO has taken in proposing the changes under PRR 1280. As I noted before, we've worked closely with the ISO since executing the operating agreement in 2017. This collaboration included consultation and meeting with the ISO RA team on the credit for the intake and gene load interruption program. We've endeavored to be transparent and collaborative with the ISO since joining in 2017. And despite this history of cooperation and collaboration, MWD did not learn of the ISO's intent to change course on respecting our local regulatory authorities' RA program and use of our load interruption to meet MWD's RA requirements until the ISO rejected our annual RA plan on October 30th. Even then, we had no clear explanation of what the ISO was doing or why until the ISO filed its legal brief last week. This has been an alarming departure from the normal course of dealing with the ISO, and one that's inconsistent with our experience of the ISO process for proposing important changes with significant impacts on ISO stakeholders. It's for these reasons that MWD urges the ISO to rescind PRR 1280 and initiate a stakeholder process to fully and carefully examine in a transparent way the concerns the ISO has with the LRA programs to count interruptible load towards RA requirements. We think this examination should look at the different types of demand response programs, their purpose and function, because we don't think a one-size-fits-all approach is reasonable. We believe that a reasonable approach could be crafted to give the ISO the benefit of relying on MWD's interruptible load during times of need without requiring that MWD pump load be bid into the ISO markets as a supply-side resource. Thank you for your time today. We appreciate the opportunity to participate, and this concludes my remarks.
Thank you very much, Sean. Scott Gonzalez?
Quick sound check?
Yes, I can hear you. Thank you.
Great. Mr. Mainzer, Mr. Colleton, and Ms. Crowley, and all the other CAISO Executive Appeals Committee meeting participants. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today about PRR 1280. My name is Scott Renzel. I am the Director of Portfolio Management at Pacific Gas and Electric Company, a California investor-owned utility. Collectively, the group of folks involved here have spent a significant amount of time on this issue, and we hope today's meeting will result in a mutually agreed upon method forward. PG&E respectfully requests that the Executive Appeals Committee put PRR 1280 on hold until the implications of putting DR programs on the RA supply plan and DR accounting for resource adequacy can be addressed. The CAISO's PRR 1280 modification to Section 4.1 of the BPM for reliability requirements issued on August 27th proposed to change its treatment of credits used for demand response, not just for local RA resources, but for all demand response counting as RA. CAISO's proposed BPM language indicates that the CAISO would only allow credits that have a net neutral impact. And the CAISO stated in order for this new process to be technically feasible and effective, these resources must be shown to the ISO on supply plans as resource adequacy capacity. PG&E, like others on the call today, is troubled by how this change was released and with limited notification and inadequate CPUC and stakeholder involvement. While CAISO staff stated in their answer to appeals document that they exceeded the requirements of the change management process with PRR 1280 based on an expedited timeline and outreach, the expedited change management process failed to coordinate with the appropriate stakeholders and failed to provide a reasonable schedule that aligns with the annual RA cycle. First, the CAISO did not coordinate with the CPUC as part of the RA guide process, which has previously been mentioned, to indicate through comments, verbal or written, that they would no longer accept the DR RA crediting process established and documented by the CPUC. I'll note that this was taking place at the same time that the CAISO was talking with their board about this exact issue in July. Second, the change did not align with the RA cycle, annual cycle, which typically runs through June and through the end of October. So a late August introduction of the idea would be extremely challenging to complete inside of that cycle. CAISO's August 27th issuance of PRR 1280 without notice to the CPUC and so close to the filing date did not allow either policies in place to authorize the CPUC to allocate credits for individual resources between IOUs and CCAs or for an implementation process to be established and will likely lead to increased rates for customers. This change has put PG&E between a rock and a hard place, and we can either comply with the CPUC or with the ISO, but not both. And we are not alone in this challenge. The IOU and the demand response program RA benefits are allocated to LSE, and in turn, the LSE customers pay for those programs through their distribution rates, such as community choice aggregators. These DRRA credits today are allocated by the CPUC at the LSE level, not at the resource level, and due to current rules. Additionally, IOUs do not know and should not know for market-sensitive reasons the load share ratio of each LSE. Therefore, neither the CPUC, based on current authority, nor the IOUs, based on available information, can apportion the credits for DR by load share ratio at the resource level. This results in an inability for IOUs to comply with both the CPUC and the CAISO's RA supply plan rules and creates uncertainty for the IOUs and CCAs and other load-serving entities. To address this uncertainty, LSCs will have to over-procure as a result of late timing or lack of coordination associated with the execution of PRR 1280. While the CAISO's answering brief claimed that this over-procurement concern was misplaced, and that PRR 1280 does not preclude the previously credited resources from being RA capacity, as long as they are shown on RA plans and supply plans. This argument chooses to ignore the CPUC's role in allocating these credits and the authority they need to implement such change by resource instead of by LSC. Again, PG&E cannot comply with both CPUC RA rules and CAISO's PRR 1280 in a manner that does not unnecessarily increase rates or risk as a result of procurement that does not provide added reliability. As the CPUC noted in October 20th comments, CAISO's refusal to count over 1,500 megawatts of demand response as a system resource for 2021 will likely lead either to load-serving entities procuring additional capacity to meet the newly created CAISO requirement, or to CAISO procuring excess capacity through the capacity procurement mechanism because it identified a shortfall that the CPUC did not. To be clear, this can and will have a material impact on rates. Reliability and resource adequacy require active participation and oversight from both the CAISO and the CPUC in order to be successful, and PRR 1280 runs contrary to that objective. This change has created confusion and uncertainty surrounding the valuation of demand response and ability for LSCs to utilize it. Given the recent August and September 2020 heat waves, it is very clear demand response is a valuable system reliability resource and should be treated as such. We understand and acknowledge the CAISO's concern about demand response resources and the CAISO's responsibility to address system health and reliability. We share that concern and want to drive towards a shared solution with all stakeholders. While other appellants have discussed long-term needs to address we'll talk about treating DR as a variable energy resource and counting methodologies for it. Some of these changes will take time. However, what the Executive Appeals Committee can do today is put this PRR on hold so that the implementation issues can be addressed, so that LSCs like PG&E can comply with both the requirements of the CPUC and CAISO in order to put DR appropriately on the plan. Accordingly, PG&E respectfully requests the Executive Appeals Committee put PRR 1280 on hold until implications of putting DR programs on supply plan and DR counting for resource adequacy can be appropriately addressed. Thank you very much for your time, attention, and consideration, and I'm happy to answer any questions in the later part of the session.
Thank you very much, Scott. Appreciate it. And last appellant would be Jeff Nelson. Go ahead, Jeff.
Good afternoon. First, thank you for the opportunity to speak with the Executive Appeals Committee. As noted, I'm Jeff Nelson from Southern California Edison. SC is requesting that the ISO withdraw PRR 1280 and instead work within the CPUC's current RA-OIR Phase 4 framework to refine the treatment of the IOU-DR programs. And it's been noted just for PG&E that it's absolutely crucial that CPUC and CAISO rules work in harmony, and that's just needed to facilitate efficient procurement, to make sure there's consistent compliance, to help reduce costs, and to ultimately minimize any ISO backstop activities. So we do strongly encourage cooperative work through that CPUC process. We strongly support DR, and we want to see DR improved. We want to see DR expanded. I think all stakeholders agree that it's absolutely crucial for the reliability in the ISO and also for all Californians. All the benefits have been discussed that come along with a carbon-free reliability. And this resource was absolutely crucial during the August and September events. And I think all stakeholders would agree that there were just outstanding efforts done through the demand response communities and individuals to help us manage through those crises. And really outstanding work. And we really want to try to capture some of the benefits we saw and be able to institutionalize that and get even better at demand response in the ISO. Just to note that the ISO, or SC's programs that participate with the ISO, have QCs that exceeded 800 megawatts in both August and September through AC cycling, our ag pumps, BIP programs, very robust participation. And as noted, we want to continue that. We don't want to put in any rules that are going to harm that. We want to make sure the rules help us grow that and have it become an even more important resource going forward. So as to the specific proposal and the issues we have, the concerns we have, we took a look at the rules and what that would mean on putting on the supply plan. We conservatively estimated, because of the way penalties work and the variable nature of our programs, that to comply and make sure the ISO is getting proper information, it would probably cost customers in our footprint at least $6 million, just sort of the collateral impacts of compliance. And that's an unnecessary $6 million. There's benefit. We don't see benefit for that cost. And that's likely a very conservative number because that won't include any additional potential backstop costs that might come from this program, or if there was additional procurement above and beyond what we've done to backfill that. So this proposal does have a material cost. And given that it is material, it really is an issue that something that has material impacts on rates, terms, and conditions, and this clearly does, really needs to go through a tariff change process. And I think that's going to be universally true for any proposal that has a significant impact on the way things operate and causes those sort of threshold conditions. So structurally and procedurally, the PRR is an inappropriate place to make material changes, particularly when the costs are so large. As noted, demand response behaves, at least the IOU programs, there's a host of programs, but the IOU programs in play here, behave much more like a variable resource. That is, when it's hot out, we typically have more access to demand response. On a cool or mild day, we may have less. But the proposal in the PRR treats things consistent and doesn't recognize the variable nature. And in our view, on its face, by failing to recognize the unique nature of demand response programs, the proposal itself is not just unreasonable. We have problems with the proposal, the costs, the procedural mechanism that's being used to promote it, and importantly, the lack of coordination with the CPUC rules, putting, as PG&E noted, IOUs in a very difficult spot in compliance. We do have also the concern that the rules are in effect re-rating the qualified capacity of programs that we believe the CPUC has the jurisdiction to determine. So as framed, we are concerned that it is a jurisdictional reach into the PUC's purview, which also is inappropriate. We think all of that can be worked out, and we think there are ways of improving. And the proper way of doing that, and we're fully supportive, is through cooperation between the ISO, the utilities, other stakeholders, and the PUC through the open OIR. And we strongly encourage this PRR to be withdrawn and for us to work constructively in that PUC process. We welcome the opportunity to work constructively there. We look forward to finding ways to make demand response even more robust, more dependable, more reliable moving forward. So thank you for the opportunity to offer comments. And again, we'll be available for questions after this portion of the agenda. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeff. I think unless my colleagues want to ask questions now, we can go to the ISO staff perspective.
Okay, thank you, Stacy. I have no questions at this point. This is John Gooden, Senior Manager of Infrastructure and Regulatory Policy. I'm going to do an overview of PR 1280, our concerns, and then turn it over to my colleagues to go into additional details and discussion. But first, the ISO understands that PR 1280 is unpopular with certain stakeholders, as we're hearing today. But this does not mean that this change is not improper or unnecessary. To the contrary, this update to the ISO's Reliability Requirements Business Practice Manual is an appropriate, overdue, and needed revision to a practice that has been unsanctioned and is inconsistent with the ISO tariff, and most concerning is a growing threat to the ISO's core mission to maintain the safe and reliable operation of the grid. Noteworthy, the ISO has raised this RA crediting without showing concern with the PUC informally and formally since 2017. More than a tariff concern, PRR 1280 is fundamentally about preserving the integrity of the RA program and the supply side resources the ISO depends on to safely and sustainably operate the grid. PRR 1280 does three important things. Number one, it prevents local regulatory authorities from using RA crediting without showing as a means to opt out or abrogate the ISO's RA tariff rules and obligations. Two, it ensures there is no unduly discriminatory or preferential treatment among RA resource types for their provider, and it prevents a race to the bottom where LSCs simply credit and not show RA resources. And three, and most importantly, it ensures the integrity of RA resources and ensures they can meet their shown RA capacity amounts. I'll briefly touch on these 3 points. Number one, crediting RA resources without showing means RA resources have no tariff obligation to bid in the ISO's market to enable the ISO to meet its daily reliability needs. And if these resources don't perform or they underperform or they're simply unavailable, then they are not subject to the RAIN non-availability charges and have no capacity substitution rules like all other RA resources. Fundamentally, RA resources that are not shown simply do not have the same incentives or obligation as shown RA resources, which undermines the RA program's efficacy, its integrity, and it jeopardizes reliability. Second, LRA crediting practice also cause unduly discriminatory and preferential treatment among LRAs and among different RA providers. For example, two physically identical RA resources are not equivalent if one has to adhere to the ISO's tariff obligations and the other does not. And importantly, not all RAs are engaged in this crediting practice, which means crediting without a showing can one lead to leaning on the shown RA capacity of other LRAs and LLCs, and two, again, it will spawn a race to the bottom where LRAs stop showing their RA resources. Why wouldn't they? Third, and finally, some stakeholders have stated that eliminating this crediting practice would expose credited demand response resources in particular to RAIN non-availability charges and underlying demand response programs is unreasonable and expect these resources to meet the RA tariff provisions because the underlying demand response programs were not intended for that purpose. They also note how expensive it would be to begin showing these DR resources on their supply plans. Frankly, these stakeholder concerns generate much greater and more fundamental concerns for the ISO. Specifically, these comments call into question the integrity and the capacity value of credited programs. The LSC's credited resources would generate significant RAIN charges due to high unavailability or submitting bids lower than their credited RA capacity amount, and the claimed RA credit is likely inflated, which leads the ISO system into jeopardy, and particularly during stressed system conditions. And let's be clear that energy system emergencies, transmission emergencies, they don't always occur in August at peak hours. We've had system emergencies in early February in the ISO's more recent history, so knowing and valuing resources for their true RA capacity value is imperative to maintaining reliability all hours of the year. In conclusion, as supply conditions tighten, this practice of crediting without showing is neither appropriate nor sustainable as a good utility practice, nor is in compliance with the ISO tariff. So PRR 1280 is an exigent matter the ISO must resolve promptly. That concludes my remarks.
Thank you, John. I think, Anthony, are you next?
Yeah, this is Anthony Ivankovich, Deputy General Counsel for Regulatory. I think in assessing the merits of PRR 1280, we need to put the DPM change into its proper perspective. It's not a referendum on how well DR has performed or the benefits DR provides. It's not a referendum on whether DR can even be an RA resource. PRR 1280 does not prohibit DR resources from providing RA capacity. PRR 1280 stands for the narrow proposition that credited resources providing RA capacity, including DR, must be shown on an RA plan and a supply plan. No state statute or policy cited by the appellant addresses, let alone precludes, this specific requirement. Appellants also ignore that numerous DR resources already are shown on RA plans and on supply plans. Importantly, the ISO tariff requires all resources providing RA capacity to be shown on an RA plan and a supply plan. This requirement is reflected in various tariff provisions and definitions. For example, the ISO tariff defines an RA resource as a resource that is designated in a supply plan to provide RA capacity. RA capacity is defined as the supply capacity of a resource adequacy resource listed on a RA plan and a supply plan. The tariff is crystal clear. If it's not on a supply plan, it's not RA capacity. The CPUC argues that if demand response reduces RA requirements, then the ISO has to accept it. The credits that are affected by PRR 1280 are not credits that reduce RA requirements. They are credits for resources to meet RA requirements that are established through the separate and distinct processes of the PRM, demand forecast, and local capacity setting processes. I think if the CPUC and others want to use DR to reduce RA obligations, they may pursue that through the demand forecast setting process, and PR 1280 does not preclude that in any way. Some of the appellants argue that, PRR 1280 is impinging on LRA's authority regarding qualifying capacity calculation. This ignores that under the ISO tariff and FERC orders, the LRA's authority is limited to determining the qualifying capacity of RA resources. As I mentioned earlier, RA resources are only those resources shown on an RA plan and a supply plan. Disallowing credits for resources not shown on RA plans and supply plans does not contravene an LRA's authority to calculate the qualifying capacity of RA resources that are shown on RA plans and supply plans. If credited resources are shown on these plans, the LRA, not the ISO, will be the one to set the qualifying capacity for the resource. Edison objects to showing its credited DR resources on supply plans because it might subject them to rain charges for unavailability. However, numerous other DR resources providing RA capacity are shown on supply plans and are subject to rain. Both Edison and Klika argue that credited resources should be exempt from rain just like wind and solar resources. This would require both CPUC-ordered changes to the DR counting rules and an ISO tariff amendment on matters not directly related to PRR 1280. Presently, the basis in the ISO tariff and under FERC's orders for exempting wind and solar from rain does not apply to DRR resources because their qualifying capacity is not calculated like the qualifying capacity for wind and solar. Thus, there is no undue discrimination as Klika claims. The ISO has been a proponent for applying a new, more appropriate counting methodology for DR that is similar to wind and solar resources. If something like that were to occur, then I think some sort of RAIN exemption would be considered and would be a distinct possibility. Lastly, contrary to CLECA's suggestion, the ISO cannot simply ignore its tariff, and it cannot simply ignore FERC orders. And that concludes my comment.
Thank you, Anthony. David Zlotlow is next.
Yeah, hi. Good afternoon. My name is David Zlotlow. I'm Senior Counsel in the Legal Department at the ISO. So Anthony addressed some of the jurisdictional objections and some of the related topics going to jurisdiction. So in my time here, I wanted to address some of the other objections that appellants and stakeholders raised in the appeal process and in the underlying PR process. So the first of those arguments is that a lot of parties raised a concern that a FERC filing is necessary to implement these changes that we're proposing through PRR 1280. I think the specific argument is really that this change impacts rates, and because it impacts resources that have already been secured to be RA or to potentially be RA through the crediting mechanism. So in that view, this is a change that affects rates. Rate changes need to be filed with FERC. And behind that, there's also a more general sense that this is just too important of a change to be a BPM matter, and that instead it needs to go through some sort of stakeholder process or policy initiative. So in response to that, as Anthony mentioned already, this topic we feel is already covered under the tariff. To us, that raises the question of what tariff amendment would be necessary if we're merely implementing the existing tariff. And further, now that we've identified the compliance issue, we can't willfully disregard it by maintaining the status quo. And on the question of this being a rate change, as we pointed out in our brief, the real question is whether the ISO is changing its rates. The PRR reinforces existing tariff language, so we don't view this as an instance of the ISO changing its rates. Rather, we're ensuring that our practice aligns with the filed rate. So on the next topic, parties have raised the concern that this is inconsistent with the authority granted through the Slow Demand Response Initiative. In response to that, I think the key point here is that the ISO staff did not pursue PRR 1280 to implement anything from the Slow DR initiative. That initiative was not fundamentally about RA crediting. We recently filed the tariff amendments that were authorized from the board approving that initiative, and if you pull that filing, you'll see that pertains to financial settlements and how slow demand response resources are dispatched. It was not about RA crediting. The topic did come up in that context, but fundamentally that initiative was about slow DR. CAISO's operational and compliance concerns with RA crediting apply across all resource types and all types of RA. And as we explained in the underlying PRR process, the slow DR initiative first highlighted, didn't first highlight it, but that was the context in which the issue of crediting was highlighted, but our concerns do extend beyond just that particular type of demand response. Third, on the timing, many parties have raised this concern that the timing of the PRR was inappropriate given where it fell in the RA procurement cycle, and it wasn't done with enough advance notice. We certainly acknowledge there are concerns with the timing, and Greg Cook in a moment will address an accommodation the CAISO staff believes would address that issue in a way that meets our needs. But focusing solely on the timing issue, we do want to point out we did follow the established BPM change management process, and as we explained in our brief, we do feel we went beyond the bare minimum of that process. We did reach out to all of the LRAs when the PRR was first posted so that this PRR would not get lost in the shuffle, that the LRAs would be impacted about this would have a chance to clue into the PRR process and raise their concerns there. And then secondly, we did create this new expedited BPM appeal process to address the concern that the ISO potentially could issue CPM designations before the appeal process was completed. So we are having this appeal hearing on December 1st. We will have I guess the appeal committee will post their decision in approximately a week. All that will play out before we have to make any potential year-ahead CPM decisions. So there is opportunity to raise those concerns. Finally, I'll speak to the issue that some parties raised that whatever concerns the ISO has can be addressed through existing procedures or through less restrictive means. Particularly, parties have pointed out that the ISO already gets information on the IOU demand response programs, which are the largest impacted group of the formerly credited resources. And then also parties have pointed out how DR performed during the August and September heat waves to show that the changes of PRR 1280 are not necessary. But again, those points don't address the concerns that have motivated PRR 1280. Most importantly, it doesn't explain how the formerly credited resources will necessarily meet the tariff definition of RA capacity. It doesn't explain how they will be subject to the RA tariff provision. Most importantly, the RA must offer obligation, which is really the most important thing about being RA capacity. And third, it doesn't demonstrate how the resources that have been credited are necessarily capable of meeting the ISO's capacity needs on a consistent basis. And then finally, some parties in the appeal and in the underlying PRR process suggested that the ISO could look to adopt rules that focus on one particular LRA's practices or different LRA's practices depending on how objectionable the commenter thought a given LRA's practices was. We don't think that's feasible. We think that we need to focus this broadly across all LRAs. It's the concept fundamentally of things counting for RA that aren't subject to the RA requirements. That's what we're trying to address, and that wouldn't be fixed by focusing on any particular LRA's crediting decisions. So with that, I'll conclude my comments and pass the baton over to Greg Cook.
Greg? David. Greg, if you aren't on the speaker line, you'll have to enter the question queue by pressing #2 so we can unmute your line. Just do want to remind everyone that we have reached our 10 minutes, so we need to conclude comments here pretty quickly.
Hi, this is Greg. Anybody hear me?
Yep.
Okay, great. So I will close out our comments with an olive branch. While we stress the importance of PRR 1280, we do acknowledge, as David said, that the timing is not ideal. So to help mitigate some of the timing impacts, we're open to a transition period, and we've had separate discussions with several stakeholders indicating that we are agreeable to exercise the ISO's discretion not to procure backstop capacity for monthly RA deficiencies resulting from PRR 1280 in 2021. Specifically, we propose the following. In order to count the currently credited DR towards meeting monthly RA requirements, starting in 2021, LSCs would show their credited DR resources on supply plans for the amount the resources can reliably and dependably provide during their respective DR programs' availability hours in their monthly RA showings. And this would have the benefit of limiting the LSC's RAIM exposure, because if the shown megawatts reflect the resource's actual capabilities, they would not be subject to those RAIM charges. And it would also provide the ISO with increased visibility into the availability of the resources. Furthermore, if the shown resources were to perform above the RAIM performance threshold, they would actually be eligible for RAIM incentive payments. Now, although the ISO would notify LSCs and LRAs of a deficiency if an LSC's RA capacity shown on RA supply plans did not meet their RA capacity requirements, the ISO would agree to exercise its discretion and not backstop in 2021 for monthly resource adequacy showing deficiencies, whether that be collective or individual, related to the use of DR credits and supply plan showings. Then to facilitate this, the LRA would agree to provide the demand response credits or any other credits disallowed because of PRR 1280 to the ISO so that it could evaluate whether the RA deficiencies were related to PRR 1280 or due to some other issues. Then, starting in RA compliance year 2022, the ISO would make CPM designation decisions for local, collective, and individual LSC, local system, and flexible capacity deficiencies based solely on LSC's shown resource adequacy in their annual and monthly supply plans. So by providing this year-long transition period, we believe it would provide LSCs and LRAs time to transition to the full implementation of PRR 1280 in 2022. This time can be used to develop more accurate counting rules that can account for the variable nature of the DR resources. It can also be used for more flexible LRA rules that would enable LSCs to show and use dependable capacity amounts in their RA showings, or to adjust contractual provisions that would be necessary to meet resource adequacy requirements. And with that, I conclude our remarks.
Thank you, Greg. I think now we'll open it up to public comment. We know that Western Area Power Administration would like to speak. We have Koji Kawamura available, I think, on the phone, and then we will take other public comment.
Koji, if you could press #2 so the operator can identify your line and unmute you, and we'll get started.
Yeah, this is Koji Kawamura with the Western Area Power Administration, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak this afternoon. I just want to let you know that WAPA understood that this BPM dealt with the adjustment submissions, such as the DR resources that are currently being discussed by many entities today. And as a result, WAPA didn't understand that this BPM would undercut WAPA's LRA plan until the ISO rejected WAPA's RA showing, which just happened recently. And WAPA had discussions with the ISO on why it was rejected, and as part of those discussions, the ISO informed WAPA that its CVP generation could no longer be included in WAPA's monthly showing under WAPA's monthly showing under the BPM, even though it's provided under WAPA's LRA plan. And this raised significant concerns for WAPA, and that's why we weren't involved earlier, because we didn't understand the impacts of this. Now, as we have understood the tariff from the time that these provisions for RA were included, there was supposed to be deference to the LRAs and federal agencies. And so WAPA, like the CPUC and MWD, is an LRA, and we have the authority that's designated to us as provided in the tariff. Now, when the ISO filed this tariff at FERC in 2006 as part of MRTU, and later made revisions to it under the IRRP process, WAPA was involved in those processes, and we commented quite a bit to ensure that the LRAs were recognized as having authority over its load and jurisdiction over its generators. As federal generators, WAPA has an obligation to first use that generation to meet federal load, federal project use load, and then federal statutory loads, and then federal preference customers before making it available to the market. And WAPA's LRA plan recognizes how this whole process works. WAPA developed its LRA plan in conjunction with the stakeholders. We had discussions with stakeholders, including the ISO, and we developed it through the Administrative Procedures Act. And through that process, we followed this LRA plan for the last decade, more than a decade, and there haven't been any problems with it until now. Then all of a sudden, we find out that it's, what we have in the LRA plan is no longer sufficient to meet the requirements of the BPM. And as we stated earlier, that the tariff provides discretion to the LRAs to determine, in the first instance, what qualifies as RA capacity. And the ISO now has gone and made a fundamental change to those provisions of the tariff. And so as a result, we think that if they want to go down this road, it needs to make sure that it files a tariff revision and goes through to those tariff provisions that provide discretions to the LRAs and needs to modify those. And we need to be able to have, at least have FERC determine whether those changes are just and reasonable. We don't think that's appropriate for a BPM process. And so I want to thank the ISO for listening to us. And again, we believe that there are some significant concerns with doing this through a BPM process rather than through a tariff amendment.
Thank you very much, Koji. Are there other members of the public that would like to speak?
As a reminder, you can enter the queue by pressing #2 on your telephone keypad. Candace, will you let us know if any callers are in the queue?
There are none at this time.
Okay. Well, I will open it up to my colleagues, but I appreciate those who provided comments on this issue. I'll just do some procedural remarks and then I can turn it over to my colleagues. We will take all these points and comments raised during today's meeting into consideration and plan to provide a written decision by December 9th next week. That decision will be posted to the BPM Change Management webpage. Just as a couple points of procedure, if the appeal is approved, the ISO will implement the committee decision on December 16th. And if the appeal is denied, appellants may bring this issue to the next regularly scheduled board meeting, which is on December 16th and 17th. Any remarks or comments from my colleagues, Roger or Elliot?
This is Elliot. Stacy, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. I just wanted to thank everybody who participated in today's hearing. The presentations are very informative and helpful as we go into deliberations. I just wanted to thank everybody for their professionalism, and certainly I think we all have a fundamental shared interest in reliability and transparency and rigor, and making sure that we're doing the best that all of us can do to keep lights on California. So that will be I think ultimately that and keeping us all working constructively in the same direction are, I think, are two fundamental objectives as we go into our deliberations. So just appreciate everybody being here today, and thanks to my team and to all of you for participating.
Thank you, Elliot.
Yep, and I will mirror that and just Roger and just note that I don't have any further questions or any questions. I did find the presentations very helpful and informative as well.
As did I. I think I appreciate everybody's really thoughtful presentations and comments. So with that, I'd like to conclude today's Executive Appeal Committee hearing and really thank everybody for their participation. I hope you all stay healthy and safe.
Thank you, everyone. Have a nice evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.